Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to Ramacro. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing a few thoughts on the future of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, this is not the first video where I've addressed this theme. I did in fact make a video nearly 4 years ago titled, "What Does the Future Hold for Jehovah's Witnesses?" Thumbnail here if Tibor is gracious. I was watching that video or bits of that video just recently, and I guess it's not aged too badly. I did make at least one prediction that came true fairly quickly. I do expect at some point, hopefully in the near future, the numbers of publishers to enter negative growth. And I think that when that happens, the obvious excuse that's going to get offered by the organization is, oh, the love of the greater number is cooling off. That's the kind of ready-made excuse, I think, for witnesses to be able to interpret a decrease in numbers. And I do expect, the numbers are already stagnant, so they've been at 1.4% growth for the last 2 reporting years. 1.4% is just basically head barely above water because, as I've already mentioned previously, the birth-death ratio takes you to something like 1%. So they are basically keeping afloat just by making babies at this point. So I predicted that in the near future, as of 15th of April 2019, the organization would surely enter negative growth, which it did in the 2020 service year report when they posted figures of minus 0.6% growth. So within a fairly short time, I came good on that prediction. And I'm giving you this example to show you that I do sometimes get it right when it comes to the organization. But I have changed my mind on one of my predictions or one of my expectations for the future of the organization, which I guess can be summed up in the following clip. I think being a Jehovah's Witness in future decades will be more about keeping a candle burning in your own home for a religion that has dwindled to such an irrelevance that you can't really find evidence of it in terms of kingdom halls or large gatherings. It's something that people have to do kind of privately. That when I imagine what it would be like to be a Jehovah's Witness in, say, 50 years from now, that's what I'm imagining. I think that there's a very likely possibility of Watchtower going bankrupt. I've spoken about this before. Any organization that can get into debt, that can have a deficit, in other words, they've spent more money than they brought in, and therefore they have to loan it from someone. You're not telling me Watchtower doesn't loan money from banks. Any organization that can do that is at risk of going bankrupt, especially if that organization is fighting off lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, and very costly lawsuits, as we saw was the case in Montana. It seems to me, I know I've been saying this for years now, and it hasn't happened, but I just wonder how sustainable it is for basically. To avoid going bankrupt, Watchtower needs drastic downsizing, even more drastic than we've already seen. If they can downsize drastically enough and fast enough, they might avoid bankruptcy. But even then, there are no guarantees. So it will be fascinating to see what happens moving forward. But even if Watchtower were to go bankrupt, I believe the religion would still continue. So that you would have, as I mentioned earlier, that scenario of being a Jehovah's Witness being a private thing that your family does, and it's no longer necessarily about going to certain places. It's about reading old literature. It's about watching old videos, and it's about keeping the candle burning for a once prosperous, successful religious organization in hopes that it might one day return. So for a long time, I held the view or expectation that the Jehovah's Witness organization as an entity could or would go bankrupt, to the point where being a Jehovah's Witness was purely, or would be, a purely private thing. A bit like with the Bible student movement or Russellite movement today. I mean, they do meet, I think they do annual meetings or whatever. They do assemble, but it's a pale shadow of what the organization used to be in its heyday. It's really more of a personal or family thing. And my expectation for a long time has been that we might see the Jehovah's Witness religion dwindle to the point where there is no longer an organization. The organization has perhaps gone bankrupt, and instead you have people, I don't know, in tiny communities or in families or as individuals, kind of keeping the faith going and hoping that one day the faithful slave might return, something along those lines. I don't really think that anymore. I've changed my mind, which I reserve the right to do. I think, obviously, I've seen a few things now. I've been doing this job for over 11 years, being a Jehovah's Witness activist. I've spoken to a number of people, not just in the Jehovah's Witness sphere, but also people connected with other groups, people who have experience with groups like Scientology. Some of you will have seen my recent conversation with Mike Rinder, thumbnail here, if Tibor is gracious. I've spoken to former members of Nixium, again, thumbnail here to a conversation with Sarah Edmondson. And I'm forming the opinion that the Jehovah's Witness religion is almost certainly going to be around for many decades to come. I'm trying not to be too negative or anything. It's not all good news for Jehovah's Witnesses if you stay tuned, but I think that it's unrealistic that in my lifetime we're going to see the organization go bankrupt or just disappear, so that being a Jehovah's Witness is something that only happens on an individual basis. I just don't see that happening in my lifetime anymore. I think back in sort of 2015, I think it was the May 2015 JW Broadcasting episode, when Stephen Lett made that remarkable appeal for funds, around about that time, there was quite a bit of anticipation that maybe the organization could be on the ropes. And indeed, we did a Watchtower in Focus episode, again, thumbnail here if Tibor is gracious, regarding leaked footage of basically the financial department, which then was under the stewardship, I guess, of Alex Reinmuller, talking about how small their contingency was for things to go badly for them. You know, how small their margin of error was, essentially, on a year-by-year basis. Well, since then, as I understand it, the finances for the organization are no longer under Alex Reinmuller. They are under Gaius Glockentin, who it seems has been sort of brought in to steady the ship. You know, he is the fixer. He's the one who has a vision for keeping the organization sustainable. And I think he's succeeding. You know, here we are in 2023, and sure, the organization is continuing to stagnate in terms of members. I think it was 0.4% growth for the 2022 service year report. And they lost a whole bunch of congregations. So, you know, in some ways, they're shrinking, at least in terms of the numbers of congregations. But in terms of members, they're barely keeping their heads above water. But if you think about what the organization is up against in terms of its reputation online, in terms of, you know, the child sexual abuse scandals, in terms of the wealth of information that's there, if you just do any kind of objective research, for the organization to be where it is now, where it still can claim millions of followers. I mean, I personally don't think it is 8.5 or however many million followers, because whenever you have a captive organization where you're forced to believe and you're not allowed to doubt, those numbers will always be an inflation of reality. But for the organization to have millions of followers still this deep into the 21st century, this deep into the information age, I actually think that's quite remarkable. And it doesn't bode well if we're thinking about the potential longevity of the organization. I think for them to have come this far and still be able to attract thousands of people each year in terms of baptisms, even if, let's say, they go through, you know, a prolonged period of either stagnating or negative growth, I think we could still end up 50 years from now with an organization that can boast millions of members. And when you have an organization with millions of members, you still have an organization that can do damage on an unfathomable scale. Think of how small Scientology is. And again, I'm thinking about my recent conversation with Mike Rinder. I mean, they're a tiny organization of maybe 10, 15,000 members maximum. And yet they still have a pulse. You just cannot kill the thing. You know, they're still going. And it's tiny. But because during their heyday, they were able to amass such a huge portfolio of property and real estate, because they were able to make hay while the sun was shining, they're still a kind of a going concern. And although you could argue that they're far more vulnerable due to their very small size than, say, Jehovah's Witnesses are, for them to still be around, considering what they've been up against, I mean, imagine if Jehovah's Witnesses had the same kind of exposure on them that Scientology has had on it over the last couple of decades. For me, Scientology has been getting way more exposure, mostly due to the celebrity connections and that sort of thing with Tom Cruise and what have you, John Travolta, Kirstie Alley, the late Kirstie Alley. Imagine if Jehovah's Witnesses had a percentage of the interest that is placed on Scientology. Probably they would be far worse off. And yet, even with all of that negative exposure and a very, very a tiny, tiny following in terms of actual membership, Scientology is still punching. That they just refuse to die. And, you know, when you think about it in those terms, I'm sorry, I just don't see the organization going anywhere anytime soon. I don't even think they are financially as precarious as I once thought. Because, again, I kind of allowed myself to buy into this idea that they were on the ropes financially. They were really desperate for them to make that appeal in the May 2015 broadcasting episode. And then when the information got leaked out about how small their margin of error was in terms of their contingencies, I just allowed myself, I think, to get a bit carried away and to think, oh, you know, it's just a matter of time before, you know, they're bankrupt and everything just kind of starts to implode. I just don't see that happening anymore, because they have, as with Scientology, such a huge real estate portfolio, and they've cottoned on to the fact that this is where their future lies, to the point where almost every other video they make or JW broadcasting episode they make is banging on about building something. Oh, wouldn't it be great to be a volunteer on this new building project? They're not daft, are they? They know that's where their future is. They know that if they can turn a percentage of the money they're receiving into assets, into real estate, then they are essentially securing their long-term survival. They've realized this, and they're doing something about it. I don't see them going anywhere. There is, however, something that could change, that could turn the tables. It's just that I don't see it happening. I really want it to happen. I just don't see it happening. And it would need to be something along the lines of what happened with Nixium. So when Mike Rinder and I recently got together and had our interview, Mike mentioned that Keith Raniere, the founder of Nixium, it's almost as though when he started that organization, he studied Hubbard. It's almost as though he studied Hubbard and figured out a more concentrated version of Hubbard's ideology, of Hubbard's manipulation tactics, and expressed it in his organization, Nixium. It's just that in doing that, Keith Raniere ended up breaking the law, and now he's in jail for a very, very long time. And the fact that cult leaders can overstep, as was the case there, the fact that cult leaders can go to jail, means that it is at least possible that the governing body could one day go to jail. Do I see that happening in the near future? No. And the problem is that the media and, I don't know, journalists in general are frankly negligent in shining a light on the child sexual abuse problem. We literally have a situation, I can't believe I need to keep saying this with no one doing anything about it, along with many others who are talking about this. We have a situation where an organization is hoarding criminal evidence on specific accused individuals accused of child sexual abuse on a scale of thousands, and no one is interested in doing anything about it. I've even spoken about it on BBC News, for goodness sake. I've literally said it live on BBC News. This is what's happening. And no one wants to do anything. And it's just like, oh, that crazy guy, you know, probably he's just exaggerating. As long as journalists and the press and the media do not do anything or do very little, or as long as what little they do gets ignored, as you could argue was the case with the work of Trey Bundy and with more recently the Cole Bethel podcast by The Telegraph, as long as there is no public outcry, governments and government agencies and the judicial system will do nothing. Because it seems to be only when there is public outcry that things can start to happen. Now, in the case of NXIVM, very, very clear and obvious crimes were perpetrated so that Keith Raniere could be prosecuted. And again, he's now in jail. In the case of the governing body, what they're doing, if it isn't illegal, should be illegal. And unfortunately, we live in a time where there is so much deference to religion that religions are able to get away with what Jehovah's Witnesses are getting away with. And Jehovah's Witnesses know it. They know they have this protection, this basic protection. They've even tried to appeal to the Supreme Court on the basis of religious privilege so that their internal record keeping can be completely untouched and no one can demand any records from them. So they know they have this privilege and they will always play this card time and time again. And while they have this privilege, and while journalists and the media in general look the other way, there will be no public outcry, and without any public outcry, the governing body won't go to jail. And if the governing body don't go to jail, there will always be an organization. So I guess that's why I've done this video, how I've changed my mind. I hate to be all negative. I wish it wasn't the case. I wish I was wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Maybe I will be wrong. Who knows? I would love to do a video in the future where I end up eating humble pie and saying, hey, here's a clip of me being all doom and gloom, but boy, was I wrong. Maybe I'll get to do that video one day, but I just think it's really important that we manage our expectations. Look, I don't think this is going to go on forever. There's surely going to come a time in the future when cults are taken seriously and when it's not okay to hoard criminal evidence and protect pedophiles, whether you're a religion or not. I like to think that if humanity can stick around a bit on this planet, despite its best efforts to ruin our planet and destroy itself, I like to think that if humanity can stick it out for a few more centuries, future generations will have all this stuff figured out and they will look back in horror at what was still going on in the information age in the 21st century and say, how was this allowed to continue for so long? They knew about it and they weren't doing anything about it. I like to think that time will come. I just think it's in the distant future. I think that future activists, future journalists, future lawmakers will bring about the change that so many of us yearn for. And rather than seeing that as a reason to give up, to say, hey, there's nothing we can do about it, let's all go home, I actually view that as extra motivation, because we need to carry the baton, don't we? We're continuing the work, if you think about it, of past generations of former Jehovah's Witnesses, the likes of Ray Franz, the likes of Carl Olof Jonsson. There are so many over the years, over the decades, who've done fantastic work in exposing the trickery, the lies, the abuse of the organization. And I think it belongs to all of us in whatever way we can to continue that legacy so that there's something for future generations to build on, so that they're not just starting from scratch, you know? I think we're all standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to the progress of humanity. And in this particular area, even if we don't live to see the end of this cult, at least we can do our bit now. At least we can contribute to the ongoing struggle so that future generations get to have their day in the sun. And that's what it's all about for me. And that's why I really, really appreciate all of the support for this channel. It really means a lot to have so many of you not just interested, but also engaged as patrons and members. But whether you're an active participant, whether you're an activist or a supporter or a patron, or just kind of cheering from the sidelines, or just watching the whole train wreck unfold, at least you're taking an interest, and at least, quite frankly, you care. And that's more than can be said for so many people in our society who have the power to do something and do nothing. Let's keep caring, and maybe one day a future generation will get to see a new dawn where there is less abuse by cults, and Jehovah's Witnesses in particular. So that was all I really wanted to say in this video. Don't forget that you can watch more such videos by subscribing to the Lloyd Evans channel, but that's all I have time for. Thank you so much for watching.